You think Depression-era families suffered through bland, joyless meals during those bitter winters? Think again. When temperatures dropped and pantries ran bare, desperate ingenuity produced some of the heartiest, most resourceful dinners in American history. Let's dig into 30 cheap winter dinners poor families ate to survive the Great Depression. Hot grits with bacon drippings were the winter breakfast that kept families warm long before the sun climbed up over the rooftops. Grits were cheap, filling, and dependable, which made them perfect for cold seasons when the body needed something hearty to face the day. Grandma saved every spoonful of drippings from the skillet, pouring them into a jar she kept near the stove like it was treasure. When the water boiled and the grits began to thicken, she added a little scoop of those drippings, stirring slowly until the pot turned creamy and rich. The smell alone was enough to pull children from warm beds. This breakfast did not need anything fancy. The flavor came from the memory of yesterday's meal and the promise of today's strength. It tasted like warmth you could hold in your hands, the kind that spread through your chest and made winter mornings feel possible. This was not restaurant food. This was real food made by people who understood how to stretch flavor across days. Hot grits with bacon drippings tasted like comfort, resourcefulness, and the quiet determination to start the day with something good. Cornmeal drop dumplings in broth were a warm meal born from desperation and a little genius. When meat was scarce and soup looked too thin, a quick cornmeal batter could save dinner. You'd mix cornmeal with water or milk, pinch off little balls, and drop them into bubbling broth to puff and soak up the flavor. They came out soft, dense, and delicious, tiny golden pillows floating in the pot. The smell of simmering broth filled the house, carrying a quiet promise that everyone would eat tonight. It was the kind of recipe that stretched the smallest pot of soup into something that could feed a family. Some added onions or pepper, others just relied on the broth to do the heavy lifting. Either way, it worked. Cornmeal drop dumplings didn't just fill bellies, they lifted spirits. They were proof that a handful of meal and water could turn hunger into gratitude. Tomato soup with grilled cheese was the rainy day classic that never failed to make kids feel warm from the inside out. The moment a storm cloud rolled in, kids would start hoping their mothers would make this exact combo because nothing else matched the feeling of dipping a buttery sandwich into a bowl of steaming soup. The soup usually came straight from a can, cheap and dependable, mixed with water or milk to make it smoother. As it heated, the rich tomato smell filled the room, promising comfort before you even took the first bite. Meanwhile, the grilled cheese sizzled in a pan, the bread crisping in butter until it turned that perfect shade of golden brown. When the cheese melted completely, stretching in strings when you pulled the sandwich apart, you knew dinner was going to be perfect. Kids could barely wait for the soup to cool down before dipping the sandwich into it, soaking up all that warmth and flavor in one bite. It was simple, cheap, and so easy that mothers could make it even on their most exhausted days. But it never felt tired or ordinary. It felt like kindness in a bowl. It tasted like being taken care of. Kids begged for this meal because it felt like a warm hug, the food equivalent of being wrapped in a blanket while the world outside stayed cold and gray. It was childhood comfort at its absolute best. Spam and eggs were the emergency dinner that never felt like one. Spam was the meat that came in a tiny rectangular can, and once you heard that suction sound as it slid out, you knew what was coming. You sliced it thick or thin, fried it in a pan until it crisped at the edges, and served it alongside scrambled eggs that may or may not have come from a powder. It was salty, greasy, and surprisingly good. If you grew up eating it, that is. Some people looked down on Spam, but when money was tight, Spam was a lifesaver. It had a long shelf life, required no refrigeration, and could be stretched across several meals. It showed up in casseroles, sandwiches, and stews, but next to eggs, it felt like breakfast for dinner, which somehow made everything okay. You would douse it in ketchup or hot sauce, whatever you had, and you would eat it at a small table with mismatched chairs and flickering lights and think, this could be worse, and it often was. Tomato custard casserole turned two everyday items, canned tomatoes and eggs, into a richly flavored dinner that captured the resourcefulness of the 1960s. The eggs were whisked with milk and a pinch of sugar before being poured over chopped tomatoes and breadcrumbs, then baked until the custard set and the top turned slightly caramelized. This casserole provided protein, vitamins, and comfort all in one dish without requiring expensive meats or elaborate preparation. Many families served it with buttered toast or a simple green salad, letting the natural acidity of the tomatoes balance the creamy custard. The recipe became a reliable weeknight option because it used inexpensive pantry staples that were always on hand. Its smooth texture and gentle sweetness made it appealing to children, while adults appreciated the subtle complexity that developed as the tomatoes baked. This unassuming casserole is a testament to how mid-century cooks could transform basic ingredients into something hearty, nourishing, and surprisingly elegant with little more than patience and a hot oven. Corncob jelly was one of the most surprising Depression-era creations, turning what was usually discarded into something sweet and useful. After eating or cutting kernels from corn, families would boil the stripped cobs for a long time until the liquid turned golden. With sugar and sometimes pectin, this liquid became a jelly that spread easily on bread or biscuits. It had a mild corn flavor, slightly sweet, and it gave people a way to stretch ingredients without buying fruit for jams. Since sugar was often rationed or expensive, this jelly was seen as a clever way to create a sweet treat out of nothing more than scraps. Many families remembered it fondly, not only because it was thrifty, but because it represented resourcefulness at its finest. Children often spread it on cornbread or stale bread softened in milk, turning waste into dessert. It may seem odd today, but back then it was pure ingenuity. Cane syrup ginger cookies were the winter sweets born from necessity, shaped by families who could not afford refined sugar but still wanted something warm and comforting. Cane syrup was cheaper, accessible, and kept well through the cold months, making it a trusted companion in countless kitchens. Grandma mixed it with flour, fat, and ground ginger, creating a soft dough that smelled like holiday spice even on ordinary afternoons. When the cookies baked, they spread into soft, chewy circles with edges that crisped just enough to snap gently under your teeth. The flavor was deep, warm, and earthy, the kind of sweetness that lingered rather than shouted. Families cherished these cookies because they brought joy without requiring ingredients that winter budgets could not handle. They tasted like generosity in lean times, a reminder that sweetness did not need to be extravagant to matter. Cane syrup ginger cookies were humble but powerful, a dessert that made cold days feel kinder. Evaporated and powdered milk were the quiet heroes of the poor man's pantry, the kind that didn't look like much but made all the difference. When fresh milk was too expensive or too far to fetch, these tins stepped in. Powdered milk mixed with water could be used for baking, breakfast, and even feeding babies when nothing else was around. Evaporated milk had that thick, sweet flavor that made coffee richer and pies creamier. It was comfort in a can. People learned to trust it because it never spoiled and could sit on a shelf for months. During lean winters, that security meant everything. You'd see families mix a little milk powder with oats, stretch it into gravy, or stir it into mashed potatoes. It might not have been the farm fresh kind, but it carried the same warmth. For many, those tins meant nourishment and dignity in a time when both were scarce. Instant coffee meat rub was one of those oddball ideas that somehow worked. You'd mix instant coffee crystals with sugar, salt, and a pinch of flour, rub it on cheap cuts of meat, and throw it in the oven or pan. The coffee acted like a smoky glaze, turning the outside dark and caramelized while hiding the fact that the meat was tough as rubber. It was a poor man's barbecue, full of flavor and pride. Families used it for pork, chicken, or whatever protein happened to be on sale. The smell filled the house like something from a steakhouse, and everyone gathered around pretending it was a special occasion. Even if the meat was chewy, no one complained. The magic of that bittersweet crust fooled everyone into believing it was better than it was. It was one of those small miracles from a time when making dinner meant making do. Mashed potatoes with Hamburger gravy were the comforting, savory meal that made kids race to the table before the pot even left the stove. Mothers browned small amounts of ground meat, then stretched every drop of drippings into a rich gravy with flour, water, and simple seasoning. Poured over a mound of fluffy potatoes, the gravy turned an inexpensive side into a full meal. Kids loved how the potatoes soaked up the sauce, every bite warm and satisfying. It felt indulgent without being complicated or costly. Mothers appreciated how far a single pound of meat could go when used this way, feeding several people with ease. Kids begged for it because it tasted like the kind of comfort only home could offer. Mashed potatoes with Hamburger gravy were proof that thrift could still taste like abundance. Cabbage and noodles, Pulaski if your grandma called it that, was a gift from the old country wrapped in poverty. You boiled egg noodles until they were soft, but not mush. You fried cabbage and onions in butter or oil until they collapsed into golden ribbons. Then you tossed it all together and prayed the flavor was enough. It was peasant food, proudly so. Born from resourcefulness, not recipes. Even when money vanished, this meal stayed dependable, like a friend who never left. It was not pretty, and it did not try to be. Just beige on beige with a hint of steam. But it filled the house with the kind of smell that made you feel like someone was taking care of you. Even if that someone was just you, doing your best. The dish had roots in Eastern Europe, but in American kitchens it became something else. An immigrant memory passed down through empty cupboards and tight budgets. You could eat a giant plate for under $1 and still feel like you ate something real. Because you did. Hominy and bacon casserole offered hearty satisfaction with minimal ingredients, highlighting how resourcefulness defined many mid-century meals. Creamy canned hominy provided a naturally sweet base that absorbed the smoky flavor of crisp bacon bits sprinkled throughout. A light sauce of milk and butter bound everything together before baking, creating a dish with comforting richness despite its simplicity. Families often served it as a main course with a side of green vegetables or a slice of cornbread, making it a complete and inexpensive dinner. Hominy's long shelf life and low price made it a dependable pantry staple, while just a few strips of bacon added enough depth to please meat lovers without straining the budget. The casserole reheated beautifully, so leftovers were welcomed for quick lunches the next day. Its combination of smooth texture and smoky taste made it popular at potlucks and church gatherings where thrifty recipes were always appreciated. Hominy and bacon casserole remains a testament to how modest ingredients can deliver true comfort and memorable flavor when prepared with care and creativity. Mock banana pudding was the sort of dish that showed just how inventive Depression-era cooks could be when real ingredients were simply out of reach. Bananas, once imported luxuries, quickly became too expensive for families to buy. To make up for it, people leaned on banana extract, which could be purchased cheaply and used sparingly to add flavor, layered with homemade custard, when eggs and milk could be spared, and stacked between vanilla wafers or leftover bits of stale cake. The pudding felt surprisingly close to the original. Families would chill it in an icebox if they had one, though often it was served warm right from the stove. For children, it was a rare treat that offered the illusion of a fruit dessert, even if no fresh fruit was present. In many homes, mock banana pudding became a stand-in for celebration desserts, stretching scarce supplies into something families could still enjoy together, and for many, it carried the sweetness of hope itself. Molasses snow biscuits were the winter morning treat families depended on when cold wind rattled the windows and sugar was too expensive to use freely. Molasses poured slow like winter honey, thick and dark, stretching sweet flavor through dough that otherwise would have tasted plain. Grandma mixed flour, baking powder, lard, and just enough molasses to tint the dough the color of early morning shadows. She shaped them quickly, hands practiced, and placed them close together so they rose against one another like a small family huddled for warmth. When they baked, the kitchen filled with the deep scent of molasses that made the whole house feel less cold. These biscuits were soft inside, with a slight crust outside, the perfect thing to tear open and eat with butter if you had it or plain if you did not. They were born from practicality but tasted like comfort, proof that even the simplest ingredients could become something worth remembering. On winter mornings when the world outside felt frozen, these biscuits made the first hour of the day feel hopeful. They were not fancy, but they were dependable, and that meant everything. Molasses snow biscuits were the kind of food that stayed in families even when circumstances changed, whispered from one kitchen to another, because no cookbook ever bothered to capture their worth. Canned tomato sandwiches were the taste of summer when nothing else was left in the fridge. You'd pop open a can of whole or sliced tomatoes, drain them just enough to stop the bread from falling apart, then slather both slices with mayonnaise. A sprinkle of salt and pepper went on top, maybe a little sugar if you came from the South, and that was lunch done. It was cold, slippery, messy, and perfect all at once. The juice soaked into the bread, softening it until every bite felt like a mix of tang and cream. It wasn't a fancy sandwich, but it was the one that kept bellies full on long, hot afternoons when money ran out before the month did. Some people added lettuce if they had it. Most didn't bother. It was simple, nostalgic, and surprisingly satisfying. The flavor was sharp, honest, and comforting in a way that no processed meal could be. It didn't matter that it came from a can. It still tasted like home. Every bite told a story of resourcefulness and grace under pressure. For families in the 1980s, canned tomato sandwiches were proof that even the simplest things could feel like love. Fried rice was the kitchen's answer to, "What can I do with leftovers?" You took yesterday's rice, never fresh, always cold, and tossed it in a hot pan with oil. Add eggs if you had them. Add vegetables if they were not wilted. Add soy sauce and stir until everything sizzled. Sometimes there was meat, bits of chicken, strips of Spam, leftover pork chops cut into tiny pieces. It was not a recipe. It was a response to scarcity. Every ingredient was a compromise that somehow came together as comfort. You learned to make it without measuring, without rules, just instinct and need. But often, it was just rice and hope. Fried rice was the clean-out-the-fridge dish, the we-cannot-waste-anything dish. It was salty, savory, and never tasted the same way twice. But it always worked. It fed a crowd, it reheated well, and it made you feel like a real cook, even if all you did was throw things in a pan. Barley and mushroom gravy bowl brought hearty texture and deep flavor to the dinner table using ingredients that cost only pennies per serving. Pearl barley was simmered until tender and spooned into bowls, then generously topped with a thick mushroom gravy made from sautéed onions, sliced mushrooms, and a splash of milk or broth. The barley's nutty chewiness paired perfectly with the savory gravy, creating a meal that was both comforting and surprisingly filling. This dish proved that meat was not necessary to achieve a rich, satisfying flavor, making it popular among families seeking economical vegetarian options. Barley stored well and cooked in bulk, so a single bag could supply multiple meals over the week. The recipe also welcomed leftovers, allowing home cooks to add bits of vegetables or herbs on hand without increasing the cost. Served with a simple green salad, barley and mushroom gravy bowl became a quiet star of thrifty 1960s kitchens, showcasing how whole grains and careful seasoning could create a dinner that felt indulgent despite its humble origins. Cornmeal dumplings in broth were one of those Depression-era tricks that turned the most modest soup into something that felt like a meal. Flour and wheat were often expensive, but cornmeal remained relatively cheap and widely available. Families would mix cornmeal with water and a little salt to form a simple dough, shaping it into small balls and dropping them into a pot of thin broth. The broth itself could be made from vegetable scraps, meat bones, or even just salted water. But once the dumplings simmered and swelled, the dish felt hearty. Mothers often relied on this trick to stretch a single pot into enough servings for large families. Children loved the dumplings because they had a soft, chewy texture, almost like a treat floating in their soup. Adults valued the filling quality, which helped stave off hunger when no second helpings were possible. Cornmeal dumplings showed the ingenuity of turning something inexpensive and basic into comfort food. In many households, this dish became a staple, remembered later not for its luxury, but for the way it managed to make empty cupboards feel just a little less empty. Rice and raisin warm bowl breakfast was the winter morning hug families turned to when the cold settled into the floorboards. Old rice from the night before was never wasted. Grandma reheated it with butter, milk if she had it, and a handful of raisins or whatever sweet thing was within reach. The pot warmed slowly, thickening into a soft, comforting bowl that filled the kitchen with a cozy scent. It was simple, cheap, and filling. The kind of breakfast that kept children warm on the long walk to school. Families did not need instructions to make it. They only needed memory. This warm bowl tasted like care, like a small kindness given before the day demanded more than anyone wanted to give. It made winter mornings feel gentler. Hamburger hash was the skillet miracle that made every child in the house sprint to the kitchen the moment they smelled it cooking. Mothers made it by combining ground beef, diced potatoes, onions, and whatever seasonings they had on hand, stretching a small amount of meat into a meal that fed everyone without costing much. The potatoes would brown slowly, getting crisp on the edges and soft in the middle, while the onions melted down into something sweet and perfect. The beef sizzled alongside everything, creating this savory blend that filled the entire home with a smell that no hungry kid could resist. It was a one-pan treasure, the kind of meal that made the kitchen feel warm and alive. Kids loved it because every spoonful felt different. Some bites more potato, some more meat, some deliciously heavy on onion. It was the kind of dish you could pile high on a plate and still go back for seconds, even thirds if you were lucky. Mothers liked that it stretched ingredients, saved money, and kept stomachs full for hours. Many families added ketchup, some added gravy, some ate it exactly as it came out of the pan. There was no wrong way to enjoy hamburger hash. It was cozy, hearty, and the definition of comfort food long before that phrase became trendy. Kids begged for it because it tasted like home in the most uncomplicated way possible, like the kind of dinner that made the whole family sit together without any fuss. It was simple, cheap, and unforgettable, which is exactly why it became a quiet legend in so many 1960s homes. Fried Bologna chips were genius, born out of boredom and thrift. You took a slice of Bologna, cut it into quarters, and tossed it into a hot skillet until it curled up like bacon and popped around the edges. The smell alone could pull anyone to the kitchen. The sizzling sound was pure comfort, like something important was happening on the stove. A paper towel would soak up the grease, and before long, you'd be snacking on salty, crispy bites that tasted like meat candy. It was perfect for game nights, cheap beer, or payday eves when you wanted something crunchy without opening a bag of chips. Some folks dipped them in mustard, others stacked them between white bread with a smear of mayo. It wasn't fancy, it was food that did its job. Fried Bologna chips were the working-class answer to bacon, proof that good flavor didn't need a big budget. It was something to look forward to after a long week, and in its own greasy way, it made life taste a little better. Hot dogs and baked beans were the dinner of choice when you had 5 mouths and $1. This was not about taste. This was about calories. You dumped a can of beans into a pot, sliced up some hot dogs, and let the whole thing simmer until it bubbled like lava in a cartoon. The beans were sweet, sticky, and filled with brown sugar or molasses, depending on the brand or the sale. The hot dogs were sometimes boiled first, but usually not. They were cut into coins and stirred in like meat confetti. You served it with white bread, not because it matched, but because it was there. No plates necessary, just bowls and spoons and the quiet acceptance that this was dinner, again. For some kids, this meal was a treat. For others, it was a warning sign. You knew what kind of week it was by how often it showed up. Still, it filled you up, and that mattered. The salt hit your tongue and stayed there. Even now, you probably remember that smell. Sweet, smoky beans and sizzling hot dogs coming from a chipped pot on a rusty stove. Bologna and apple skillet combined two humble ingredients in a sweet and savory partnership that captured the playful side of 1960s home cooking. Slices of bologna were quickly browned in a cast iron skillet, then tossed with diced apples and a small knob of butter until the fruit softened and released its natural juices. The salty meat and gently sweet apples created a flavor that felt surprisingly rich despite the low cost. This dish made excellent use of ingredients that were almost always on hand: inexpensive deli meat and seasonal fruit. Families appreciated its speed on busy weeknights, while children were drawn to the fun contrast of tastes and textures. Served over toast or alongside mashed potatoes, it became a complete meal that proved resourceful cooks could create memorable flavors from the simplest pantry staples. Decades later, it remains a reminder of how imaginative combinations could turn everyday items into an unexpected treat without straining a modest household budget or requiring elaborate preparation. Mock fish cakes were a thrifty invention for families who longed for seafood but could not afford it during the Depression. Instead of fish, mashed beans or leftover potatoes were seasoned with onions and herbs, then shaped into patties and fried. When browned in a pan, they resembled fish cakes in both texture and appearance, providing the illusion of a more expensive meal. Families often relied on beans because they were cheap, nutritious, and available through relief programs, making them the perfect base for this dish. Some households even added breadcrumbs or stale crackers to stretch the mixture further. While it might not have carried the same flavor as real fish, it was filling and hearty, which mattered most in those years. For many children, mock fish cakes became a familiar supper, remembered later with a mix of humor and nostalgia. They embodied the era's spirit of improvisation, turning simple, humble ingredients into something that felt like a substitute for luxury. Snow ice winter treat was the kind of dessert made only when the weather allowed and families were willing to believe in small magic. Children raced outside with bowls when the snow fell clean and soft, scooping the freshest patches before footsteps ruined them. Grandma mixed the snow with milk, vanilla, or whatever sweet syrup she had, stirring quickly before it melted into slush. The result was light, cold, and sweet, a winter miracle that cost nothing and delighted everyone. This treat was born from imagination, resourcefulness, and the willingness to find joy in scarcity. It tasted like childhood, like laughter echoing through cold air, like winter turned into something gentle. Snow ice winter treat was a memory more than a recipe, one that families held close long after the snow disappeared. Hot dog fried rice was the 1980s answer to fast food when nobody could afford the drive-thru. You'd grab the leftover rice from the night before, toss it into a skillet, and chop up a few hot dogs to throw in. The soy sauce packets saved from cheap takeout finally earned their keep, sizzling as they hit the pan. The smell filled every corner of the kitchen, salty and smoky with a little sweetness from the rice. If you had an egg, you'd crack it right in and stir fast, watching it turn the whole thing golden. If you didn't, no one complained. The hot dogs carried enough flavor to make it feel like a real meal. It looked humble, but it tasted like triumph. Families made it at the end of the week when groceries ran low, and somehow it always hit the spot. It stretched scraps into dinner, turned leftovers into pride, and reminded everyone that creativity was just as filling as wealth. Kids didn't know it was poverty food. To them, it was comfort on a plate. Hot dog fried rice was the flavor of resilience, sizzling proof that even struggle could taste good if you knew how to fry it right. Cornbread and honey was one of those simple comforts that made every 1960s kid feel like they were getting away with something sweet before dinner. Mothers made cornbread from the cheapest ingredients you could find in any pantry: a little flour, a little cornmeal, a little milk, and maybe an egg if the week had been kind. The batter came together quickly, but the moment it hit the oven, the whole house transformed. That warm, buttery smell drifted through every room, telling kids exactly what was coming without a single word being spoken. When the cornbread came out, golden and steaming, it felt like a gift. Mothers sliced it into thick squares, the kind that crumbled just a little at the edges, and handed it out while it was still warm enough to melt anything that touched it. Then came the honey, drizzled or poured, depending on how generous she felt that day. The honey seeped into all the little cracks, turning a humble piece of bread into something rich and sticky and perfect. Kids loved how the sweetness balanced the savory corn flavor, creating a dessert that was not technically a dessert but felt exactly like one. It was cheap, filling, and made from ingredients almost every family always had on hand. Mothers relied on it because it stretched tight grocery budgets without ever feeling like a compromise. Kids begged for it because it tasted like warmth, like comfort. like the kind of simple sweetness that sticks in your memory long after you grow up and realize how much your mother made out of so little cornbread and honey, was proof that dessert did not have to be fancy to be unforgettable. Beans and cornbread was the gospel of the broke South. Pinto beans soaked overnight, slow-cooked all day, and served steaming hot with a thick slice of cornbread. This was not just dinner. This was survival seasoned with tradition. The beans were soft and earthy, flavored with salt, onions, or maybe a ham hock if someone blessed you. The cornbread was crumbly and golden, sometimes sweet, sometimes not, depending on what part of the country raised you. It was not just a recipe, it was a ritual passed down from someone who learned to stretch a dime into dignity. Even if it was humble, it still brought people to the table like it was a Sunday feast. You broke off chunks and dipped them into the beans like it was communion. And in some ways, it was. Families gathered around it. Conversations started over it. Empty stomachs were quieted by it. It was a meal you could eat for days without getting tired of it because it tasted like home, like history, like someone cared enough to soak the beans instead of rushing a can. And even if they had to rush it, canned beans and boxed cornbread mix, it still counted. It always did. Peanut butter and celery rice surprised many families with its simple combination of protein and crunch while staying true to the spirit of economical cooking. Hot-cooked rice was stirred with a generous spoon of peanut butter until it melted into a creamy coating, then finished with finely diced celery for freshness and texture. The nutty flavor provided satisfying richness without the need for meat, while the celery added a pleasant bite that kept each spoonful lively. Children enjoyed the mild sweetness of the peanuts, and parents appreciated how the dish delivered both carbohydrates and protein at a very low cost. It could be served as a warm side dish or as a light vegetarian main course alongside a crisp salad. This inventive recipe reflected the era's openness to global influences and practical experimentation, proving that even unexpected pairings could become a family favorite. Peanut butter and celery rice stands as a delicious reminder of how 1960s cooks stretched their budgets while creating meals that were nourishing, flavorful, and delightfully different. Salt pork winter greens pot was a tradition carried from one cold season to the next, built on the belief that even tiny scraps could transform a whole meal. When money was tight and fresh produce was limited, greens like collards or mustard became the backbone of winter cooking. A small piece of salt pork, barely enough to be considered meat, held enough flavor to season an entire pot. Grandma washed the greens, stripped the stems, and let them simmer until they softened into something hearty and wholesome. The salt pork gave a smoky depth that tasted far richer than its size suggested, and the pot liquor at the bottom became the best part, sipped like soup or soaked up with cornbread. Families relied on this dish not just for nourishment, but for the feeling it gave, a sense that warmth and comfort could come from the humblest ingredients. In winters, when the wind was sharp and bills piled high, this greens pot held families steady. It tasted like strength simmered slow. Mustard greens spaghetti was a southern experiment that worked better than it had any right to. You'd boil spaghetti noodles, toss them in a pan with wilted mustard greens, and hit it with a dash of hot sauce for punch. The greens were bitter, the pasta plain, but somehow it came together into something hearty and bold. It was the perfect marriage of Italian thrift and southern grit. Some folks added a spoonful of margarine to mellow the greens. Others went heavy on the spice to make it sing. It was an accidental recipe that spread through kitchens where fresh produce was rare and creativity was required. Mustard greens spaghetti might sound strange to anyone who didn't live through lean years, but for those who did, it was genius. It filled your stomach and left you proud you'd made something out of almost nothing. It was humble food with heart, and that made it better than any restaurant plate. Fried pinto beans were the real muscle behind every hard-time meal. They were humble, sure, but they were also one of the most important foods ever stocked in American pantries. Poor men relied on them because they were cheap, filling, and versatile enough to become anything, from stews to soups to spreads. You could buy a big sack of dried beans for a few cents, soak them overnight, and stretch one pot into several days' worth of dinners. When meat disappeared from the table, beans stepped up. Mothers would season them with salt pork or just a spoonful of lard, maybe toss in an onion if they had one. The result was hearty and comforting, proof that flavor could be coaxed out of almost nothing. Beans didn't just feed stomachs, they fed communities. Churches, farms, and neighbors shared sacks during bad winters, knowing that beans meant everyone would eat. The smell of a bean pot simmering on the stove was a signal of warmth, of life continuing even when money was tight. They were the kind of food that asked for patience but gave back comfort in return, a true testament to the art of surviving with grace. Potato soup with saltines was the cozy, creamy dish that made cold nights feel warmer with every spoonful. Mothers made it because potatoes were cheap and easy to turn into something hearty. With just a little onion, salt, and pepper, the soup simmered into a smooth, comforting pot that filled the house with warmth. Kids loved watching steam rise from their bowls and dipping saltines until they softened like little clouds. Every bite tasted like care and calm, perfect for nights when the wind outside felt too sharp. It was filling without being heavy and somehow tasted even better the next day. Simple, inexpensive, and deeply comforting, potato soup with saltines became one of those meals kids never forgot. Winter bean pot with cracked corn was one of those slow-cooked meals that sat on the back burner all day, filling the house with a deep, steady warmth that felt almost like a blanket. Beans were the backbone of many winter diets because they were inexpensive, stayed fresh for months, and grew richer the longer they cooked. Grandma poured them into the pot, added cracked corn for texture, and let everything simmer until the beans softened and the corn swelled into tiny bursts that made every spoonful feel hearty. A ham bone or piece of salt pork sometimes joined the mix if one was available, but the meal stood strong even without it. This pot fed large families with little effort, stretching into dinner, then leftovers, then the stew that came after the leftovers. It was the kind of food that held people together when the days felt long and the nights felt colder than anyone liked. Winter bean pot with cracked corn tasted like steady, quiet strength, built one simmering hour at a time. Porcupine meatballs sounded fun, until you realized the only thing spiky about them was the desperation they were made from. These were meatballs born in the hard times, made by mixing ground beef with uncooked rice to stretch every last ounce of protein. They simmered in tomato sauce, and as the rice cooked, it poked out like little white quills. That is where the name came from, someone trying to make poverty sound cute. But if you grew up poor, you know this was not about being clever. It was about making half a pound of ground beef feed a family of 5. They were fragile little things, barely holding together, and often baked in the oven or cooked in a pan until the sauce bubbled up like lava. The tomato sauce was always the cheapest kind, canned, oversalted, and slightly metallic. But it masked the blandness, and that was the goal. Sometimes people added onions or eggs if they had them. Most of the time, it was just the basics: rice, meat, and sauce. Dinner done cheap. If you ever sat at the table with 3 meatballs and a slice of bread, you knew what this meal meant. It was survival with a side of improvisation. Sweet and sour cabbage bake turned a single inexpensive vegetable into a lively main dish that brightened even the plainest table. Shredded cabbage was braised slowly with a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and a splash of tomato juice until the leaves softened and soaked up the tangy glaze. A small spoon of butter added just enough richness while keeping the budget firmly in check. The gentle balance of sweet and sour flavors made this casserole appealing to children and adults alike, offering a welcome contrast to heavier meat-based meals. Home cooks valued how it could be made ahead and reheated without losing its texture, making it perfect for church suppers or busy weeknights. Many families served it with thick slices of bread to soak up the flavorful juices, creating a meal that was both frugal and satisfying. This dish demonstrated how careful seasoning and slow cooking could elevate humble cabbage into something memorable, reflecting the creativity of 1960s kitchens where every ingredient was stretched and celebrated for its potential. Salted popcorn supper might sound like a snack today, but during the Depression it often stood in for a real meal. Popcorn was inexpensive, easy to make in large quantities, and filling enough to take the edge off hunger. Families would pop big bowls of it, sprinkle salt over the top, and gather around to share it for dinner. While it lacked the nutrition of meat or vegetables, it was a warm, shared experience that brought families together. Children saw it as a treat, while adults knew it was simply necessity disguised as fun. Sometimes popcorn was paired with milk or molasses water to add substance, but often it stood on its own. Neighbors also used popcorn suppers at gatherings, stretching limited food to feed a crowd. The dish represents how families redefined what supper meant when resources were at their lowest. It was proof that even the humblest food could provide comfort when eaten together, turning scarcity into moments of connection and shared resilience. Hot water cornbread stew thickener was one of those quiet winter tricks families relied on long before anyone wrote down a recipe. When the weather turned sharp and the pantry looked emptier than anyone wanted to admit, a skillet of hot water cornbread could stretch a pot further than flour ever could. Grandma would crumble the leftover pieces right into the bubbling stew, letting them dissolve slowly until the broth thickened into something rich and hearty. It was a method passed down through instinct, never measurement. The cornbread added body, warmth, and a flavor that made a plain pot taste like something you had planned for instead of something you simply managed to get by with. Families who worked long hours needed meals that filled you up and held you steady, and this trick did exactly that. It turned thin broth into real food and turned a small amount of ingredients into something that could feed a whole table. This was winter cooking at its most honest. The kind where you turned what you had into something comforting without asking for anything extra. And when everyone sat down with steaming bowls wrapped in their hands, nobody thought about scarcity. They thought about the way the stew clung to the spoon, the way it warmed the chest, the way it made a cold night feel survivable. Hot water cornbread stew thickener was never fancy, never written, and never forgotten by anyone who grew up on it. It tasted like resilience shaped into a meal. Cheesewater soup might sound pitiful at first, but to families scraping by, it was survival disguised as comfort. When the pantry was empty, the milk long gone, and payday still days away, a spoonful of powdered cheese stirred into boiling water was enough to lift spirits. The steam carried the smell of warmth, even if the meal itself was little more than wishful thinking. Parents whisked it fast so the powder would melt smooth, creating the illusion of a creamy broth. A few shakes of pepper or a torn piece of stale bread on the side turned it into a full supper. Kids didn't question it. They called it cheese soup and slurped it proudly. It was salty, thin, and simple, but it filled the belly and soothed the mind. For adults, it was less about flavor and more about dignity, proof that even when the cupboards were bare, there was still something to feed the family. Cheesewater soup wasn't a dish people bragged about making, but everyone who lived through hard times remembered it. It was the taste of perseverance poured into a chipped bowl, reminding everyone that even the humblest meal could feel like home. Peanut butter celery logs were the silly, crunchy snack that made kids feel like they were eating something special, even when it took almost no effort to make mothers spread peanut butter into the grooves of crisp celery sticks, sometimes adding raisins on top if they wanted to be fancy. Kids loved the contrast, the cold crunch of the celery, the creamy peanut butter, the sweet little bursts from the raisins. It felt playful, like a treat disguised as something healthy. Mothers appreciated how cheap and quick it was, especially for after-school hunger. Kids begged for it because it tasted fun, not just good. Peanut butter celery logs were the kind of simple joy that defined childhood snacking in the 1960s. Fish sticks and macaroni and cheese was the dinner you got when your mom had $5, 20 minutes, and nothing left to give. The fish sticks came from the freezer aisle, packed in a cardboard box with a picture that made them look golden and crispy, but never did justice to the soggy reality. You lined them on a baking sheet and hoped they would brown, even though the oven was spotty and the heat uneven. Then came the macaroni, bright orange and neon from a powdered cheese packet, boiled until it was soft enough to forget where it came from. You stirred the cheese in with butter, or maybe just milk if the butter was gone. And there it was, a plate that was hot, fast, and filling. You did not question if the fish was really fish. You dipped it in ketchup or tartar sauce and made peace with the crunch, or the lack of it. The macaroni clung to your fork like it knew its job was to comfort. This was a Thursday night meal, a "we'll go shopping tomorrow" meal, a "you're still growing" meal. It was not gourmet, but it was enough. Enough to fill you, enough to get by. Homemade crackers were one of the simplest yet most practical foods people baked during the Depression. With store-bought crackers and snacks out of the question, families turned to flour, water, and a pinch of salt or lard to make thin crisps. Rolled flat and baked until golden, they provided crunch and variety in a diet that was otherwise dominated by soft, starchy foods. Often, children would snack on them plain, while adults used them to stretch soups, broths, and thin stews. They could be topped with whatever was on hand, from drippings to a smear of carrot marmalade, but even alone they were satisfying in their simplicity. Families appreciated how they required little fuel and ingredients, and they became a staple for households that could not afford bread every day. Homemade crackers reflected resilience, showing how even the most basic pantry items could be transformed into something useful. They were not glamorous, but they were dependable, which is exactly what people needed most. Brown sugar sweet potato mash cakes were the winter lifesaver that turned leftovers into a second meal without anyone complaining. When sweet potatoes lingered after holiday dinners, Grandma did not throw them out. She mashed them with brown sugar, a splash of milk, and a sprinkle of spice before shaping the mixture into small patties. They hit the skillet with a soft sizzle, the edges crisping while the centers stayed smooth and warm. These cakes tasted like the echo of a holiday meal, familiar and soothing, as if the season itself refused to let go. Families loved them because they stretched what little they had and transformed scraps into something that felt intentional. Kids did not know they were eating leftovers. They only knew it tasted sweet, warm, and perfect with breakfast or supper. And in winters, when the budget needed to stretch farther than anyone liked to admit, meals like this were a quiet blessing. Brown sugar sweet potato mash cakes carried the memory of abundance into the hard months, reminding families that flavor did not disappear just because the holidays ended. They held on to comfort the same way people held on to each other through long, cold weeks. Instant oatmeal muffins were breakfast alchemy at its absolute finest, a miracle born out of leftovers and imagination. You'd empty a few packets of flavored oatmeal, apple, cinnamon, maple, or whatever was left, into a mixing bowl, crack in an egg, add a splash of milk, and stir until it looked close enough to real batter. The texture wasn't perfect, but that didn't matter. You'd pour it into greased muffin tins and bake it just long enough for the kitchen to fill with the smell of brown sugar and comfort. Moms picked up the trick from neighbors, TV ads, or recipe clippings taped to the fridge. 2 oatmeal packets could somehow stretch into 6 muffins, and that was magic in itself. They came out soft, warm, and sweet, just right for little hands on their way to school. Raisins made them feel fancy, chocolate chips made them feel like dessert, and even plain they hit every craving. Instant oatmeal muffins weren't about showing off, they were about showing love with whatever you had. They were the kind of breakfast that didn't look like struggle, it looked like care. For families trying to stretch the grocery bill one more week, that was everything. Potato pancakes made from leftover mashed potatoes were the definition of turning almost nothing into something incredible. Mothers loved this recipe because it let them stretch every scrap and avoid waste, but kids loved it because those little golden patties tasted like a true treat. It started with a bowl of cold mashed potatoes, stiff and slightly lumpy from the night before. Mothers would mix in a little egg, a bit of flour, some onion if they had any left, and seasonings that were often more instinctual than measured. She would shape the mixture into small patties and drop them onto a hot, buttered skillet. The sound alone was enough to pull kids away from whatever they were doing. The edges browned first, creating that crispy ring that every child looked for before taking a bite. The inside stayed soft, creamy, and warm, almost like mashed potatoes in their coziest form. The contrast between the crisp exterior and the tender interior made every bite exciting. Some kids dipped them in ketchup, others ate them plain, but everyone agreed they were one of the best things to ever come out of a leftover bowl. Mothers appreciated that it cost nothing extra, but still felt like a real meal. Kids begged for them because they tasted like comfort made fresh again, like getting something new out of something old. They were the kind of food that made you forget you were eating leftovers because they were even better the second time around. Potato pancakes were a thrifty triumph, a childhood favorite, and a reminder that sometimes the best meals are the ones born out of necessity and a little creativity. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches were the sweet spot between hunger and childhood. No stove, no knife skills, no effort. Just 2 slices of white bread, 1 spread of peanut butter, 1 of jelly, smashed together until they stuck. You did not toast it, you did not plate it. You wrapped it in napkins or ate it straight from the counter. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was always there. The peanut butter clung to the roof of your mouth. The jelly ran down your fingers, and somehow you never minded. It felt like a treat even though it was a budget lifeline. You ate it when the pantry was bare and the lunchbox had to look full. You ate it at home, at school, and on car rides when the air conditioning did not work. It was portable, durable, and forgivable. No one asked questions if that was your meal again, because everyone understood. It was the great equalizer of being broke. No leftovers, no dishes, just sweetness, salt, and survival on sliced bread. Rutabaga and carrot mash brought together 2 hearty root vegetables that thrived in cold climates and offered dependable nourishment long after harvest. Peeled rutabagas and carrots were boiled until tender, then whipped with butter and a sprinkle of black pepper into a smooth, golden mash. The natural sweetness of the carrots balanced the earthy flavor of the rutabaga, creating a dish that felt both rustic and refined. Because these vegetables stored well in cellars for months, families could rely on them for inexpensive winter meals when fresh produce was scarce. The bright color and gentle taste appealed to children, while adults appreciated the hearty texture and vitamins packed into every spoonful. Served alongside roasted chicken when budgets allowed or enjoyed on its own with a slice of bread, rutabaga and carrot mash exemplified the 1960s emphasis on making the most of seasonal vegetables. It remains a comforting side or main dish that highlights how frugal ingredients can combine to create something far greater than the sum of their humble parts. Rutabaga hash was a clever dish that made the most of rutabagas, which were cheaper and more plentiful than potatoes during the Depression. Families would chop the firm root into small cubes, frying it with onions and whatever fat they could find. The rutabaga softened and browned, giving a texture and taste that mimicked potatoes closely enough to satisfy hungry families. Sometimes scraps of bacon or ham were added for flavor, but more often it was just the vegetables alone. The hash was hearty, filling, and adaptable, often appearing at both breakfast and dinner tables. Since rutabagas grew well in harsh conditions, they were dependable crops when potatoes ran short. Many children grew up not realizing their parents had been serving them substitutes, because the crispy fried cubes tasted so much like the real thing. Rutabaga hash showed how families made necessity feel normal, turning cheap vegetables into meals that could carry them through some of the hardest years in memory. Red pepper winter cabbage fry was the kind of dish that came from gardens long gone quiet under frost, but still managed to show up on the table through planning and memory. Families saved dried red peppers from the warmer months, stringing them up in kitchens where they hung like little sparks waiting for their season to return. When winter settled in and vegetables became scarce, cabbage stayed dependable, sturdy, and patient in the root cellar. Grandma sliced it into shreds, heated bacon grease or whatever fat was left, and tossed it with crushed dried pepper until the pan hissed and filled the kitchen with warmth. The red pepper did not just add heat. It added life, a reminder of summer sun even when the wind howled outside. This dish was quick, cheap, and filling, which made it perfect for families trying to stretch the days between grocery trips. You could feed a whole table with 1 head of cabbage and a handful of peppers, and no one complained because the flavor was loud enough to make you forget how simple the ingredients were. This was winter survival dressed up as comfort, built on the knowledge that nothing should go to waste, and everything could become a meal if you treated it right. And when the plate hit the table, steaming and bright with specks of red, it tasted like determination warmed in a skillet. Fried saltines were the unofficial snack of the broke, hungry, and resourceful. Crackers were cheap and always around, and all you needed was a skillet with a bit of oil. You'd toss in a handful of saltines, let them pop and crisp up, then dust them with salt or pepper, or sometimes just eat them plain and hot. The result was something so simple it almost felt like a secret. The crunch was addictive, the smell buttery even when no butter was used. People made them late at night after long shifts, when dinner had been a memory hours ago. Fried saltines made you feel like you were treating yourself, even though you were just stretching the last crumbs of the pantry. It was survival food disguised as a snack, and it kept more people fed than you'd think. Baked beans on toast were the sweet and savory treat that 1960s kids loved far more than anyone would expect from something so modest. The beans came from a can, thick and glossy, smelling like brown sugar and slow cooking. Even though they had been made in a factory, mothers heated them in a pot until they bubbled softly, creating a scent that made hungry kids rush into the kitchen. While the beans warmed up, the bread went into the toaster, and that crispy foundation was what made the whole thing feel special. Once the toast popped, mothers would spoon the beans on top until the entire surface was covered, letting the sauce drip over the sides. Kids dug in immediately, often burning their tongues because they were too impatient to wait. The contrast of crunchy toast and soft beans made every bite feel exciting, and the sweetness in the sauce made it taste almost like a dessert pretending to be dinner. It was cheap, quick, and undeniably comforting. Mothers relied on it during tight weeks when money was short and time was even shorter. Kids begged for it not because it was fancy, but because it was dependable, delicious, and somehow always tasted better at night when the whole house felt quiet. It was one of those meals that did not try to impress anyone, and yet it impressed kids every single time. Liver and onions were the meal that tested your strength. This was not a dinner kids begged for. It was one you survived. A plate of pan-fried beef liver, dark and dense, smothered in soft, translucent onions that were supposed to make it taste better. The smell alone was enough to make you gag. But liver was cheap, it was full of nutrients, and it was not rationed like other cuts during wartime. So you ate it. You cut tiny pieces and tried to swallow without chewing. You drowned it in ketchup or mustard, anything to make it go down faster. Your parents called it good for you. You called it punishment. But there it was, week after week, staring back at you from a chipped plate, while the onions slid around like ghosts. And if you finished it, you felt like you had won something. You had not. But you felt that way. And sometimes, that was enough. Old-style peppery bone broth was the winter foundation that kept families steady when meals needed to stretch for days. Bones that might have been thrown away became liquid comfort when simmered for hours with onions, pepper, and whatever scraps were available. The broth grew richer with time, turning thin water into something nourishing and full of depth. Families drank it plain when times were tight or used it to make stews, soups, or dumplings as the days passed. This broth tasted like patience, like quiet strength, like the kind of wisdom families relied on long before written recipes existed. It warmed the body and eased the hunger that winter often brought. Oatmeal patties came from mornings when waste was unthinkable and every leftover had a second act. Cold oatmeal from breakfast would be mixed with an egg, maybe some flour, and fried up like pancakes in a sizzling pan. They crisped on the outside and stayed soft in the middle, smelling faintly of cinnamon or whatever sugar you'd stirred in before. It was the kind of breakfast that made sense in tight times. You already had it, so why not make it better? You could spread a little syrup on top or just eat it plain, standing at the stove with the spatula still in your hand. Kids didn't complain. They thought it was new, not recycled. Families who grew up poor never forgot oatmeal patties because they represented something special, making the most of what was left. Even when money got better, you'd find people still frying them up out of habit. The golden edges, the smell of butter, the sizzle, it was breakfast reborn. Barrel-stored apple skillet fry was a winter staple that carried the taste of fall into the coldest months. Apples stored in barrels softened over time, but Grandma knew how to revive them. She sliced them thin, tossed them into a hot skillet with butter and sugar, and let them cook until they turned golden and fragrant. Spices like cinnamon or nutmeg added warmth that spread through the whole house. This dish was simple, but it felt luxurious when fresh fruit was long gone. It reminded families that sweetness could last through winter if you cared for it properly. Every bite tasted like a memory saved for later, a reminder that nothing truly good disappears. Which Depression-era winter dinner would you bring back to warm your family's table? Drop your survival recipes and memories in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe so you never miss more forgotten flavors from American history.